Hi again, I'm Jack Lessenberry, and welcome back to Politics and Prejudices, the podcast. This is meant to be an evolution of the column I wrote and the radio commentaries I did for many years, so hope you enjoy and keep listening and watching. You can also catch up with both my writing and any essays and podcasts you may have missed on my website, lessenberryinc.com. That's ink as in ink pen. Perhaps the best thing about being a journalist is the fascinating people you run into all the way and their fascinating stories. And the purpose of these podcasts is to bring some of both to you, along with a little dose of my own perspective. So please settle back and listen. Stay tuned afterwards for my signature essay on this topic, and I hope you enjoy. And again, please follow me on my blog, lessenberryinc.com. Now for today's topic. For nearly 20 years, a battle's raged over building a new bridge across the Detroit River. The Ambassador Bridge is nearly 90 years old, is in questionable shape, wasn't built for today's huge trucks, and is in a location that, given today's traffic patterns, doesn't make much sense. It's also privately owned, and its owner, 92-year-old billionaire Matty Moroun, has spent millions fighting every attempt to build a new bridge, even though Michigan business interests have been nearly unanimous in saying a new one's needed. If something happened to the Ambassador now, the economic consequences would be devastating for both nations, especially Michigan and Ontario. Well, 8 years ago, then Governor Snyder came up with a way to build a new bridge, and after delay, ground's been broken for a new Gordie Howe International Bridge, which is now supposed to be finished in 2024. But is that finally a sure thing? Is there any way something could still stop this bridge from being built? Are there jobs available working for it? And is Matty Moroun going to build a new bridge as well? We have a panel of true experts joining us. On the phone, we have Mark Butler, the Director of Communications for the Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority, the group building the Gordie Howe Bridge. Also, Dave Battigello, the reporter for the Windsor Star, has been covering bridge issues for years. And also, on the line from Ottawa, Brian Massey, the newly re-elected member of the Canadian Parliament for that part of Windsor, Windsor West, that includes the bridge. And in the studio with me, Greg Ward, the co-owner of the Windsor-Detroit Truck Ferry, and a man who's always supported a new bridge, even though it might put him out of business. Gentlemen, thanks so much for making time to bring us up to date. I want to start with Mark Butler. Mark, where are things with the actual bridge construction?
Well, I think, first of all, your listeners will not necessarily see all the activity because the components of the bridge are sort of hidden from public view at this point in time. But if you could see it, certainly from the river, and on our website, we do publish videos quite frequently, you'll see that the bridge piers, this is the important part, the bridge piers on both sides of the border are actually leaving the ground. On the Canadian side, we have 4 of those piers in place. And when I talk about piers, these are really the footings for the actual towers on both sides of the border. So that's well underway. Of course, the preparatory activities on both sides of the border, on the Canadian and the U.S. ports of entry, have been undergone a fairly large transformation over the last number of months. We're continuing with that. And certainly the last component of the project, which is the Michigan interchange, there's considerable work that's being done. And this weekend, starting Friday night and continuing till Sunday, we're going to be demolishing 3 road bridges which go over I-75.
That's the first weekend of November, right? That's the first weekend of November.
That's right. So that's starting this Friday and continuing until Sunday night. We're going to be dropping 3 of those bridges. Springwells is one of the locations where this is where the new exit and entry ramps leading from I-75 into the U.S. port of entry have to be. So we're taking down a total of 5 road bridges. They're all going to be replaced with new road bridges, along with new pedestrian overpasses. And the first major activity for that is starting this weekend. So, when you look at the 4 components of the project, the 2 ports of entry, the bridge, and the Michigan interchange, I can tell you that work's being done on all 4 of those components at the same time. And we're on track to have this bridge in service by the end of 2024.
Brian Massey, has all the property been assembled on the Canadian side?
Yes, that's been one of the strengths of the program on the Canadian side. Is I was actually on Windsor City Council. We were acquiring a certain area known locally as the Dog Patch, but it's the Brighton Beach area for an industrial park. And so a lot of that was consolidated under the City of Windsor, which then was compensated later on for the process then known as the DRIC to create the environment that's necessary for that. So we have a lot of stuff there that's in place. We also have a connecting highway, the Herb Gray Parkway, that goes to the 401. That's been redone. And what I'm pushing for is a transfer of port property next to it, so we can create a national urban park when entering into the new crossing on the Canadian side. So there's lots of activity on the Canadian side that's very positive. There are some challenges with regards to the operations there, obviously, because it's lower in geography than other sections, and as well, there's soil and other types of considerations that had to be raised from the current standpoint to a higher elevation. So that takes years of work. So it's moving along. I think the original deadline was 2008 when this was actually proposed, right. And so we're into a longer time, but it's getting done, and we're pleased on the Canadian side.
Mark Butler, what of the Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority, what is the situation on the U.S. side?
Well, the U.S. side, we, as Brian had mentioned, on the Canadian side, we were very fortunate that the majority of the property the land that we needed to build the port of entry was owned by the city of Windsor. There were, I think, 5 private landowners that we had to acquire the property from. On the U.S. side, it was different. We had over 600 parcels of property that we had to acquire, many of them from different people. So it has taken us a different length of time to get those properties accumulated. We are in a position now that we have all the properties with the exception of a handful, but the properties that we do have allow us to actually proceed with construction. So the ones that are still missing and they will be obtained, we can still work construction around them. On the U.S. side, of course, we also have not the same geography as we do in the Canadian side. So as Brian had just mentioned, we had to do a fair amount of excavation and land preparatory work. We still have to do some on the U.S. side. We're going to be starting the installation of what's known as wick drains very shortly, which is a drainage method to make sure that the land becomes consolidated and strong. And also because on the U.S. side, there were a lot of smaller businesses and houses, we had to do a lot of remediation for contamination on properties before we could proceed. All that work, I'm happy to say, is on schedule, and we're moving ahead. And consequently, we're able also to concentrate on the actual pier construction on the U.S. side.
Dave Battigello, you've been covering this story longer and in more in depth than any other journalist. Is there anything you'd like to ask Mark about this?
Well, I was just curious. I'm more curious these days about what's going on with the Ambassador Bridge, because they've got quite a bit of construction that's been going on for the last 5 or 6 months. It's closed some city streets underneath. It seems like they've been approved to do some widening of the 90-year-old bridge. Now, they had some tentative approval from the Canadian government to go ahead with the new crossing. So I'm curious why they're spending so much time and effort to fix up the old crossing, and the conditions they have to meet for this new crossing are not being met, and they don't seem to be moving very quickly on it. So I'm real curious what's happening there.
Well, not within my my bailiwick, I guess. The Ambassador Bridge plans to build an additional crossing is completely separate and distinct from the Gordie Howe International Bridge. Having said that, when we did do the traffic studies, when we looked at through a very significant environmental studies over a number of years before we actually started construction, we had always considered that the existing crossings would remain in place as part of the gateway that's known as Windsor-Detroit. And, again, to remind everybody, the commercial traffic that crosses at Windsor-Detroit represents about 25% of the total bilateral trade between Canada and the United States. So it's an extremely important trade corridor. The Gordie Howe International Bridge will help to ensure that that will remain so for the many years to come. And the Ambassador Bridge is part of that equation.
Greg Ward, I want to bring you in here. Greg Ward, you haven't had a chance to talk to the owner of the Windsor-Detroit Truck Ferry, and you're very familiar with these issues. I'm just wondering, and other people can respond to this too, would a new Ambassador Bridge span make economic sense once the Gordie Howe Bridge is up and rolling? It would seem to me that there's so many, it takes so long to get with all the different traffic signals you have to go through neighborhoods that it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense for trucks other than Maroon's own trucks to use to use an Ambassador Bridge, even a new one, when they'd have the Gordie Howe.
I think that's right. I think the direct connection is what's so important about the Gordie Howe, the direct connection to the highway. I was looking through some old articles, and the Ambassador Bridge said they'll spend about $1 billion on a new span. And they've also said in court that they'd lose 75% of toll revenue to the Gordie Howe Bridge. So it's hard to imagine spending $1 billion for 75% less toll revenue than they get today. And I'm not sure what the economic case is. I guess some of it could be that depending on what the government of Canada and the U.S. government is going to do with the customs facilities.
Right.
So the Gordie Howe will have the latest and greatest customs facility in the world, probably the most highest technology system available. If the Gordie Howe, if the Ambassador Bridge is still operating on the old system,
Right.
I think that probably a lot of trucking companies that don't want the attention spent on them will use the Ambassador Bridge, and those who are more legitimate will use the Gordie Howe Bridge.
Brian Massey, member of the Canadian Parliament, you've been very concerned that the Ambassador Bridge Company, Matty Moroun and his family, provide community benefits for folks on both sides of the border.
Yes, the first thing that needs to be acknowledged is that the Ambassador Bridge gets a virtual doubling of their actual capacity through the enhancement of lanes on a new crossing and as well a plaza. And this was done through what's called an order in council, which is a special privileged piece of legislation that the Prime Minister and Cabinet approved separate and independent of Parliament and the Senate. It didn't go through any hearing process that would normal legislation have the right and have the expectation to go through. That means committees, it means oversight, it means consulting with not only just the community, but also businesses and other operators. It avoided all those elements that are really the important parts of a democracy. So I've been asking for an amendment to the Order in Council, which is often done the case because Order in Councils are often made with big mistakes because, again, they're set by the Prime Minister and a few people at the table independent of any advice from the outside. And community benefits were not added to that. So the Gordie Howe has community benefits. It's a small percentage of the overall economic expenditure, but it's something that the community has as part of the burden of having the border. And there is no expectations the Ambassador Bridge do. It has to actually do some work because they're going to affect, like, say, for example, the fire and safety of the area, so a new fire station has to be built. But that's to replace the problems of an increased capacity a new facility would create. So we've asked for community benefits because Sandwichtown has some of the highest poverty rates in Canada and has also had challenges with new immigrants and also is next to the University of Windsor and lastly is one of the most historic places in North America.
Right.
And it's literally under siege from these border works.
Are you getting pushback from, I doubt that the Ambassador Bridge Company is enthusiastic about the idea.
No, we haven't heard anything, but really it's up to the Prime Minister. It's a simple amendment to the Order in Council that can be made, and they wouldn't have a choice in the matter. It's as simple as that. It's not complicated, and it's only what we've asked for is comparable reciprocity with the Gordie Howe Bridge, and so that's what we've asked for as a reasonable approach to dealing with the problems because it's affecting so many people.
Mark Butler, I know you can't get into a political debate about any of this, but I'm curious about why is it going to take so long for the Gordie Howe Bridge to be built? Why is it? We have a 5-year timetable. And do we have any idea of when in 2024 it's likely to be open?
Well, I think, again, when you look at the project overall, we have really 4 components. We have 2 ports of entry, we have the Michigan interchange, and we also have the bridge itself. Each one of those projects in itself is pretty significant. Together they represent probably one of the largest infrastructural projects anywhere in North America today. So we are also looking at issues where we have to build a bridge, which will be essentially the longest cable stay bridge in North America. All that takes time. We believe that the schedule that we've been put forth, which is a 74-month construction schedule, is prudent. And it also allows time not just for the bridge to be completed, but it also allows time for fit-up. So for the the new staff working on both sides of the border at Border Protection to actually get in to get their orientation, to get their systems up and running. We've made a commitment that the bridge will be in service to traffic by the end of 2024, and we're working towards that.
Mark, before I let you go, what about, we were told that the bridge would maybe supply 10,000 jobs, certainly thousands of jobs, at least temporarily. If somebody's interested in a job on either side of the border, how can they find out about availability?
Well, I can tell you that, beyond Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority, which is a Canadian Crown corporation, and we have approximately 70 people working for us at the Crown Corporation. Our private sector partner, Bridging North America, has hired several hundred people already. We expect during the peak construction of the bridge there will be 2,500 jobs. I just took a look at it this morning. There's about 30 jobs relevant to the bridge right now, which are being advertised, and these are trades positions, consultant positions, administrative. So I recommend that people go to our website, which is www.gordiehoweinternationalbridge.com. I know that's a mouthful. Go to the Opportunities tab, and you'll see opportunities both with Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority and opportunities with Bridging North America. And they change every day. There's always many there, and we're looking for talented people to work on this historic project. The other thing I will mention is that we will be having a vendor summit on November the 13th in Windsor and November the 20th in Detroit. The Windsor location will be the Windsor Casino, and in Detroit will be the old Cobo Center, where we're asking for people who are interested to do business with us, vendors, suppliers, trades, to come in and meet with the Gordie Howe International Bridge team and find out how they can actually do work and provide supplies for this project.
Well, if you need a couple of aging journalists, it's possible Dave and I will be down there too. But gentlemen, does anyone else have any questions for Mark Butler before we let him go? Well, Mark, you've been very kind to make time for us today, and we'll probably come back to you for another update in a few months. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Brian, congratulations on your re-election.
Oh, thanks, Mark, and thanks for your good work there. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark.
Goodbye, gentlemen.
But Brian, speaking of your re-election, congratulations from all of us too. While the Trudeau government has been returned, it now is in partnership, or I presume it's going to have to be in partnership with your party, the New Democratic Party, the NDP. And I'm wondering, do you see any possibility of any change in the government's attitude toward the need for a new bridge or bridges?
Well, I hope so. I've always tried to make Parliament work, and they're going to go case by case in the Parliament in terms of support for their minority status. For those that aren't aware, is that they need to have some votes on confidence because there's just not a majority, so they need other parties to join them at different points. But I'm hopeful that we'll see some coordination and see some cooperation. Often minority parliaments have done some good things, and I'm hopeful that we can actually get, say, for example, community benefits and also more public accountability of the Ambassador Bridge. Dave has mentioned that they're unsure. He's unsure of the status of, and I think he's joined by the whole community of what's going on with the Ambassador Bridge. And I think that's unfair for the community. And second of all, I think it's unfair for operators like Greg Ward, who have a business case and a business plan and a business investment. And are doing all the things through accountability, transparency, probably more so than any other operator that we've ever had historically. And they should at least have the expectations of having provided information for what the projects on the border and what the future elements are going to be for their appropriate planning. Because it's serious business running the border. We take it for granted. But the reality is the Ambassador Bridge decides not to build or to build, it affects other operators. And that's a reasonable approach.
The Ambassador Bridge has never been subject to the sort of inspections that you would assume an international border crossing would be required to. Moroun at various times, he once claimed it was a federal instrumentality, and he's claimed immunity from that. Is there any more pressure, and anybody can jump in here, to sort of make Moroun accountable? I mean, this bridge is almost 100 years old, and we know that pieces of concrete fall off it. Are we getting anywhere where we can force it to be inspected?
They're doing a better job. They're doing a better job now. Transport Canada must be keeping a closer eye on them because the work that they're doing, they are doing some repairs on the lanes up there, on the guardrails. All of that has been rotting away for a decade or so, and they're finally getting around to it now. So I think somebody's put, tightening things up and keeping a better eye on them. The problem is they play both sides of the fence, and when it comes to legislation or regulations, what's good for them is always the way they want to do things. So that's a very unfortunate. It's been that way for forever, and since the Maroons have owned the crossing, and that's the difficulty when you have a private sector owning a border crossing like that.
Brian Massey, go ahead, please.
There was an act called the International Bridge and Tunnel Act passed that actually brings in more regulatory oversight, and Dave's kind of description of the transportation of things is accurate. In past, it was just considered private property, and it was exempt. But the International Bridge and Tunnel Act changed that. But as far as I'm concerned, there's not nearly the oversight from Transport Canada that needs to be done, not only on the project site, but also the ongoing maintenance schedule and public accountability. But it is in the International Bridge and Tunnel Act, but it has been a law that hasn't been exercised to the full extent, in my opinion.
Greg Ward,
but maybe we might be seeing that.
Greg Ward, you're the. I want you to jump in here. You're the only U.S. citizen on the group, other than me, and I don't count. And I'm wondering, you're in touch with the Duggan administration. What do you think about U.S. or Detroit efforts to make Moroun accountable?
So that's what I'm thinking of. The International Bridges and Tunnel Act ends at the middle of the river,
right?
And it doesn't apply to the U.S. side. And that's the problem is when Brian's talking about the opportunity for community benefits, again, that's going to be on the Canadian side. We don't have the same energy on the U.S. side making those demands, which is unfortunate. When you look at the Gordie Howe, which used to be called the Detroit River International Crossing, there has been at least 100 meetings on the project, regular updates to the community, opportunities for input, opportunities to object to us, to agree with them. But there's been none of that on the Ambassador Bridge project, on their twinning. There hasn't been, they had the meeting for their navigable waters permit and a few other things, but there's not the same intensity and opportunity for public input. And we really need, and I hope, Brian can reach out to the U.S. side, his colleagues on the U.S. side, and try to jointly approach this to have more oversight on the project, on the proposed project.
Quite candidly, and anybody can jump in here. I'll start with Brian Massey. Do we really think that Moroun will ever build another span? First of all, it would cost more than $1 billion by far, I would think. And or is this just some kind of a feint? Does anybody have an opinion on that?
Well, just so you're aware, the current order in council only gives him a 5-year window to start the project. And then there's a time frame he has to tear down the old span. Right. So there's complications with him proceeding and such. And I'll leave it for others. But my personal opinion is that they don't have a lot of experience building things. They've had complications with their current sites when they have done improved works. I think the number one thing the bridge could do right now is actually facilitate quicker toll paying once you actually get through the custom lines and are stacked up waiting to pay your money on the other side. But that's just my personal opinion.
We should say that one thing we cannot blame Matty Moroun for is the fact that the bridge is a private thing. The people didn't want to spend the money for a public bridge back in the 1920s, and a family not related to the Marouns built this bridge starting about 1929. 1927, I can't remember the exact date. I think it was finished in 1930, and then Moroun eventually bought it in, I think, 1979. So he inherited it. I don't think anyone would allow a private citizen to build a border crossing today.
Except we're looking at it with the twinning of the Ambassador Bridge.
Exactly.
And I think that is something that should be studied, should be discussed, should be debated, if there should be private ownership of border crossings. And I say that as a border operator. I understand the idea of private operation of a border, but it seems like a border crossing is something that should be under the national control. And because they have the security priorities, they have the trade interests, they have the border responsibilities. So at this time, the Ambassador Bridge receives a huge subsidy, and so does the truck ferry in the sense that we receive custom service on both sides. which costs great deals of money.
Right.
And this private operator pockets all the tolls. He doesn't pay back. Where the Gordie Howe, it will also have customs available to it, but those tolls go back to the state of Michigan and the government of Canada. So I think there does need to be some discussion is if it makes sense for critical infrastructure, critical to our economy, critical to our security, should be privately owned.
Absolutely. You know, Brian Massey, something this way is a little delicate. This is something that I've thought about a lot, that the fact that Canada is putting the bill for everything, including construction work on the Michigan side of the bridge, because the Michigan legislature wouldn't do it, in part because they get campaign money from Matty Moroun. The idea is that Canada will be eventually paid back for Michigan's share out of toll revenue. Is that actually going to happen, Brian Massey? And does anyone have any idea how long that would take?
Yeah, well, there's been some, I think it really speaks to the importance of the crossing to get done for our continued trade and prosperities, lifting it outside of some of the influential politics that have taken place and the connections politically that have taken place on both sides of the border with regards to border operators. But it's going to eventually pay itself off. That's going to be the case. And so that's kind of the argument for a public crossing anyways, is that, to me, it doesn't matter whether it pays itself off after 50 years, 100 years, or 200 years. The point being is that it's supposed to facilitate economic development, trade, and social conduits that are important for Windsor-Detroit region. And that's something that is invaluable. And so to me, it's less about that process getting completed. But there's 24 international bridges and tunnels between Canada and the United States, and 22 of them are publicly owned and operated. There's just a couple that are private. And I think that there's no doubt that this is part of our skeleton of the nation, and it really would be more appropriate to be handled as a facilitation. The bridge as a middleman or as a profit zone, as a border crossing, that I would argue is an inefficiency in our economy. It would be much more profitable for everybody to facilitate trade at the lowest amount possible to compete with the West and the East when we're dealing with the center of our economies right here. And adding a layer of profit versus a gatekeeper doesn't make a lot of sense, especially when we're competing for auto jobs and other new tech jobs.
I agree.
Dave Battigello, do you see anything that we haven't discussed here with respect to either the Moroun Bridge or the Gordie Howe, or government's role in this?
Well, I think the Gordie Howe has done all the right things, and it's taken a long time. But it's taken a long time for a reason. They really were careful on how they did things in terms of regulations, in terms of legislation, so that nothing could be challenged. Because the Maroons would have been quick to go to court and actually win. Now, they've still gone to court, but they've actually lost on a number of their challenges because things were done the right way. So the Gordie Howe seems to be off to a great start. There's still a long way to go relatively to a lot of people when they'd like to see this done, but it seems very secure. The Ambassador Bridge seems to be, the story is coming back to them now on what's going to happen, whether they ever will build a second crossing or not, what the plans are for this current crossing, even though it's 90 years old. So the focus is slowly coming back to them and what's going to happen. And it's important because this crossing is right in the middle of two cities that are trying to rebuild communities, trying to rebuild neighborhoods, and trying to get a good future put in place. So everybody needs to know what's going to happen there.
Greg Ward, you're very much in touch with the community. Are the community around the Delray community happy with the community benefits deal that on the Gordie Howe Bridge?
It's been tremendous, the deal that's been given by Canada, not just the $10 million here at the end that was announced as community benefits, but what was made available to Detroit to buy out people outside of the footprint. So the footprint, everybody who got bought out came through the condemnation process or negotiated first and then the condemnation. But the opportunity is given to everyone outside that footprint. The city is, instead of just offering people the money to relocate, have made a different system where they want to use land bank housing to relocate so they stay in the city of Detroit. But however that is, it's a great opportunity for these people. Not everybody will choose to leave.
Right.
Some people will choose to stay, and they can do that. And it's really been tremendous, the air filtration that they're providing, new windows, new opportunities to make the homes in the footprint area or near I-75 more secure, more air, cleaner air, etc. And I think it's been very positive, and we really need that type of attention to the community in all projects, all transportation projects that happen in the state, not just the Gordie Howe. I think this has been a great precedent, and I agree with Dave that the Canadians have done a great job. I don't think this could have ever happened if it was just Michigan paying their half. This would never have happened. And I'm very grateful to the Canadians, not only for their financing of the project, but for doing it right.
I think we should all be very quickly. We really didn't talk about what you do. You operate a ferry that takes trucks with hazardous materials primarily, or with things like windmill parts too large to go over the Ambassador Bridge, and you do that. But why might you be put out of business when the Gordie Howe's done?
So there's a good chance that the Gordie Howe it's built for a 115-year useful life. It will be anticipating all types of trucks that are going to be happening in the next century, all types of transportation. And so it's most likely going to be able to take the hazardous materials and the oversized trucks. So once it opens its door, we'll most likely be out of business.
Brian Massey, you're in Ottawa. I know you've got to get about the business of organizing a new government, but are there any other issues or facets of this issue involving both bridges that you think the public ought to keep in mind?
Well, I think that we need a overall border authority. Greg's situation is one that is commendable. He has been not only a good community partner, but he's operated the ferry, I think, for 15 years now. I could be wrong, Greg, on those numbers.
30, almost
30 years.
Oh, my gosh.
I'm getting old,
Jeez,
Brian.
But yeah, I know, exactly. It shows you how but it's a good example of how I don't even have the most up to date as the extensiveness of how complicated our operations are. And then also the planning process. So we have an operator who has a tremendously successful record of dealing with some of the most complicated materials for manufacturing, and also the consequences if there's something goes wrong over our waterway. And they should have a voice and also a planning process to deal with how we actually get those goods and services across the border, especially if there's delays or there's going to be other problems or backup contingency plans and so forth. And so I honestly believe that we need what other areas have is an overall border authority, not a cabal of different groups and organizations that have different models. And there needs to be some type of overall planning. So if, say, for example, the Windsor-Detroit tunnel is going under extensive renovations or needs to close for a weekend or something, that there's ongoing communication that's sophisticated and is done through a planning process. And then second of all, similar to what's happening right now, is why do we have like a ferry operator that deals with very sensitive materials under a high degree of regulatory environment, not even know the future of what might or may not take place? And that just doesn't make good business sense or community planning or environmental sense, in my opinion. We have really good, successful operators, and we have different things that are going on. Why not cross-coordinate that and make us more efficient, reduce the costs, and improve environmental oversight? Just seems to be the way we should be doing things.
Brian, do you plan to push for legislation doing that in Ottawa?
Yes, I have legislation that was crafted for it. The International Bridge and Tunnel Act was legislation that was stolen from me, which is a good thing, from by Lawrence Cannon at that time. That's when you're not in power like myself. You hope they pick up your ideas and run with it, and I'll have that retabled again, a binational border authority for the entire region. And again, I think that it's also creates some unique synergies when we just think about the trucks and the people and so forth. What's really kind of cool is that we're also, with the new Gordie Howe Bridge, we're going to have a pedestrian bike lane that's going to be free, and we have an opportunity to further integrate and return some of our operations that we had in the past with regards to people connecting other than cars and vehicles. We do have the transit at the Windsor-Detroit tunnel for buses, but this is going to be different. And, when you go back in the ages, we had hundreds of ferries that operated on the border at different points in time. So there's, once again, more opportunity for us to work together and be successful as a region.
That's right. I think I should mention that the Detroit-Windsor tunnel is basically a passenger car mechanism. You can't really take heavy manufacturing components, much less hazardous materials, through the tunnel. Finally, Dave Battigello, anything else you want to add that we've neglected to cover or that you want to point out?
No, I just think everything seems to be finally, after almost 2 decades, everything seems to be on track for the most part and going in the right direction. So I'm looking forward to the completion of the Gordie Howe Bridge. I'm looking forward to see how both communities, both Windsor and Detroit, can take advantage once it's in place, both economically and also from a community standpoint. You have the Fort Wayne situation there that you could really enhance that, and it could be a real tourist attraction.
It's screaming for redevelopment.
Yes, Brian's been pushing hard for a national park created around lands where the Gordie Howe is going to be. And they're all great things, and you can create something truly wonderful for the next generation if everything continues in the direction that it seems to be going. When it comes to the Ambassador Bridge, that's a different story, unfortunately, and we need to get that probably going in the same direction. If that happens, Windsor-Detroit could really thrive in all kinds of ways, both economically and just as a community for the people around here who live here.
It's sort of ironic in that Fort Wayne, which is going to be pretty much at the U.S. foot of the new bridge, was built to prevent Canada from invading us. And now we're trying to encourage as much economic invasion as possible. But Brian Massey, Dave Battigello, Greg Ward will give you the final word if you want one.
No, I think it's great that you're giving the attention to this issue because it is a great opportunity for everyone. Sometimes I think people don't realize the scale of this project and how it will transform lives forever.
Gentlemen, I so appreciate you making time for us today. I respect all of you. Please keep on doing what you're doing.
Thanks, Jack.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we couldn't almost certainly go on talking about the bridge issues, but I think we've all learned a lot today. I want to thank our guests as well as everyone who donated to help fund the production costs of this podcast, including Renaissance man Bob Howe and that talented author and editor in Dearborn, Buford Cranford. If you too would like to help keep these podcasts going, I'd be thrilled if you could send me a contribution via Zing Media Group, 186 North Main Street in Plymouth, 48170. Message me on my Facebook or via my blog for more details. Also, please check out that blog, lessenberryinc.com. Please click the button to subscribe. It's absolutely free. It's what it's worth, in other words. Tell your friends and keep in touch. This is Jack Lessenberry with the Politics and Prejudices podcast. See you again soon. Shortly after he retired from office, after a glorious 36 years in the United States Senate, I asked Carl Levin if anything had surprised him after all those years. The incredible power of Moroun, he said. I wasn't surprised. I knew, as he did, that virtually every major business, including Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, wanted a modern new bridge to connect the nation's two nations' freeways to make it easier for the billions in goods that flow across the Windsor-Detroit border every week, mainly heavy manufacturing and automotive components. For something that happened to the Ambassador Bridge, a bridge long past its expected life, the economic consequences for Michigan and Ontario would be devastating. Yet an aging billionaire had for years been able to block a needed new bridge from being built, thanks to his ability to essentially buy off the legislature. Even after Governor Rick Snyder found a way around that, Moroun has still managed to hold up a new bridge for years and further maximize his profits. This is a scandal and a disgrace, but the bigger scandal is that we've allowed him to get away with it. If you talk to anyone elsewhere in this world, even elsewhere in this nation, they think it's crazy that a private citizen is allowed to own an international border crossing, that he doesn't even allow the government to inspect it to make sure it's structurally sound. This is laissez-faire capitalism run amok and a threat to the public interest and safety. It does seem now that a new bridge is happening much later than it should have. Whether the Moroun family will ever build a second one is hard to say, but I very much doubt it. There are too many hoops that have to jump through, including relocating an entire street and a number of buildings in Canada at their own expense. Even if they did all that, it's hard to imagine that any new span they would build could be competitive with the Gordie Howe International Bridge for one big reason. Trucks would still have to run a gauntlet of traffic signals to get to Canada's main highway. The Gordie Howe Bridge is designed to roll traffic seamlessly from I-75 to Canada's Highway 401 and vice versa. Plus, not to be morbid, but Matty Moroun is 92 years old, and even if he started a new bridge today, it's doubtful if he'd be around for the opening. What we don't know is what his only child, Matthew Moroun, will do when decisions about the future will be his to make. My guess is that he'll continue operating the old bridge so long as it makes economic sense for him to do so, and then, concentrate on the vast trucking operations that are the core of the Moroun Empire. But again, I really don't know. What I do know is regardless of politics, government is supposed to operate in the public interest. By dangerously preventing a new bridge from being built for years, our legislature didn't do so. We also humiliated and disgraced ourselves on the international stage by refusing to pay our fair share of the cost of the new Gordie Howe International Bridge. Canada is in fact paying for everything, and is supposed to someday be reimbursed out of our share of the tolls both nations plan to collect, something that would take decades. This makes Michigan look like a poverty-stricken third world country, which, without a new bridge, is exactly what we'd eventually become. This is Jack Lessenberry. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll come back and hear more of my podcast again soon.